What would you do if you were cast out with nothing but the clothes on your back, a tired old horse, and $2 silver to your name? What if the only thing you could afford was the one thing everyone else had written off as worthless? For 20-year-old Lucinda Hale, arriving in the dust-choked town of Redemption Creek in the autumn of 1879, this wasn't a question. It was the hard, sharp edge of her reality. She paid her last $2 for a derelict Icehouse on the edge of town, a place so forgotten it was a joke to the townsfolk. But what they didn't know, what no one could have known, was that buried deep in the rot and sawdust was a secret sealed since the war, a truth that would rewrite the history of the town and the destiny of the girl they had so easily dismissed. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because this is a story about how the things we discard often hold the very thing we need the most. Lucinda Hale in Redemption Creek, not with a flourish, but like a stray leaf blown in by a weary wind. She and the old mare Dust walked the last 5 miles. The wagon that had carried them from the east sold for pennies in the previous town to pay for a bag of oats and a heel of bread. The mare's head hung low, her gait a slow, rhythmic plod that mirrored the beat of Lucinda's own tired heart. Lucinda's dress, a faded calico that had once been her Sunday best, was gray with the dust of 3 states. Her face, framed by strands of brown hair that had escaped her tight bun, was smudged with dirt and sorrow, her eyes holding the deep, still quiet of someone who had seen too much loss in her 20 years. Her father, a good man with a mind for numbers and a heart too soft for the world, was gone. A sudden fever had taken him, leaving his accounts and his only daughter in the hands of his business partner, Jedediah Barlow. Barlow, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, had been swift. He had patted her hand, spoken of her father's unfortunate debts, and presented her with a ledger whose columns of red ink swam before her tear-filled eyes. He had pressed a handful of dollars into her palm, a gesture of his supposed generosity, and told her it was time she made her own way. She knew, with the gut-deep certainty of the wronged, that the ledger was a lie. She knew her father had been meticulous, solvent, but she was a girl, alone, with no one to stand for her. To argue would have been to invite a worse fate. So she had packed a small canvas satchel with her mother's locket, her father's worn whetstone, a change of underthings, and a single heavy book. She had taken the one asset Barlow couldn't liquidate on paper, the old mare, a creature as worn and overlooked as she now felt herself to be, and she had walked west, toward a name on a map her father had once mentioned in passing, Redemption Creek. The name felt like a cruel joke. The town, when she finally saw it, did little to lift her spirits. It was a collection of unpainted plank buildings, huddled along a single wide street, cowering under a vast and indifferent sky. The wind carried the scent of manure from the livery, stale beer from the saloon, and the fine, gritty dust that seemed to be the town's primary crop. As she led Dust toward the public trough, she felt the eyes of the town upon her. Men sitting on the porch of the general store stopped their whittling. Women sweeping their stoops paused, brooms held mid-air. They saw the worn dress, the exhausted horse, the solitary figure of a young woman arriving with no escort and no baggage to speak of. Their gazes were not hostile, not yet, but they were heavy with appraisal and suspicion. A woman alone was a problem to be solved, a vulnerability to be exploited, or a temptation to be condemned. Lucinda kept her eyes down, focusing on the rhythmic splash of water as Dust drank gratefully. She had learned that silence and stillness were her only armor. She gave the mare the last of the oats, her own stomach a tight, aching knot. She had $2 left in the world, sewn into the hem of her shift. It was a fortune and nothing at all. She needed shelter before the cold Missouri night fell, a place to rest her head that wasn't the open prairie. Her gaze drifted to the sheriff's office, where a public board displayed deeds for sale and notices of unclaimed land. It was her last, desperate hope. She tied dust loosely to the hitching post, murmuring a soft promise to return, and walked with a straightness in her spine she did not feel toward the board. Her fingers, rough and chapped, traced the curling script on the posted papers. A small parcel of farmland, $30. A town lot with a burned-out foundation, $15. A room for rent at the boarding house, $4 a week, paid in advance. Each price was a door slamming shut in her face. Her eyes scanned lower, past the respectable properties, down to the bottom of the board where the forgotten things were listed. And there, on a yellowed, fly-specked piece of paper, she saw it. A single line written in a dismissive scrawl, the Old North Icehouse. As is, beside it, the price was written in stark, damning figures. 2 nausans, $2. The exact sum that stood between her and utter destitution. She stared at the listing, a strange stillness settling over her. An icehouse, a dark, cold, half-buried place designed to hold the dead of winter. It felt fitting. A shiver that had nothing to do with the evening chill ran down her spine. She had no other choice. She took a deep breath, the dust filling her lungs, and pushed open the door to the clerk's office. The bell above the door chimed a single, tinny note, announcing her arrival to a future she could not possibly imagine. A future that lay waiting, buried in the cold, dark silence of the most worthless property in Redemption Creek. The clerk, a man with a green visor and ink-stained fingers, looked up from his ledger, his expression shifting from boredom to mild annoyance. "Help you?" he asked, his tone suggesting he doubted it. Lucinda's voice was quiet but clear. "I'd like to buy the old Icehouse." The man blinked. He put down his pen, took off his visor, and polished it with his sleeve as if to see her better. Then a slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. "The Icehouse," he repeated, the word stretched out in disbelief. He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Miss, you don't want that place. It's a ruin. Hasn't been used since before the war. The roof's caved in. It's full of 20-year-old sawdust and rats the size of cats. The town uses it for a dump." Lucinda simply stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze steady. "It's listed for $2. The clerk's amusement deepened. "That's not a price, that's a dare," he said, leaning back in his chair. "It's what the county figures it'll cost someone to tear it down." He gestured vaguely out the window. "You're new here. You don't understand." But Lucinda did understand. She understood the hollow ache of having no other options. She understood the finality of a closed door. "I have $2, she said, her voice unwavering. "I'll take it." The sound of the clerk's laughter drew the attention of 2 men who had been loitering by the stove. They drifted closer, their faces alight with the cruel curiosity of bored men. One of them was Jedediah Barlow. He had ridden into town that afternoon, his horse fresh, his suit clean. Seeing Lucinda standing there, dusty and defiant, a smirk played on his lips. "Well, I'll be," Barlow said, his voice loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Little Lucy Hale, buying up property. What is it, girl? Decided to become a real estate magnate?" He stepped forward, his polished boots loud on the floorboards. "What's she buying, Tom?" The clerk, eager for an audience, gestured dramatically. "The old Icehouse." The men erupted in laughter. It wasn't a kind sound. It was sharp and dismissive, the laughter of those who have and who mock those who have not. "The Icehouse," Barlow boomed, slapping his thigh. "An ice castle for an ice queen. Fitting." Lucinda's face burned, but she did not look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the clerk, who was now beginning to feel a sliver of pity, or perhaps just a desire to finish the absurd transaction. He sighed, pulling a dusty deed from a drawer. "It's your money," he muttered, dipping his pen in the inkwell. "Name's Lucinda Hale?" She nodded as he wrote. She carefully unstitched the hem of her dress and produced 2 worn silver dollars, placing them on the counter. The coins seemed to absorb all the light in the room. They were her past and her future, her final connection to the life she had lost. The clerk took the money, his fingers brushing hers. He slid the deed and a single, large, rust-pitted iron key across the counter. "She's all yours," he said, his voice devoid of its earlier mockery, now just flat and tired. Lucinda took the paper and the key, her fingers closing around the cold metal. It was heavy, real. She had bought a ruin. She had purchased her own joke. But as she turned and walked out of the office, the sound of Barlow's laughter following her, she held her head high. She owned something. It was next to nothing, but it was hers. What could possibly be waiting inside that forgotten place? Why would a young woman, cast out and alone, spend her last dollar on a structure everyone else saw as trash? What secret does 20 years of settled sawdust hold? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hidden history. The journey to the Icehouse and the truth it held was only just beginning. As Lucinda stepped back into the street, the deed clutched in one hand and the heavy key in the other, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The sun was lower now, casting long, distorted shadows that made the town look skeletal. The whispers followed her as she untied dust from the hitching post. They were no longer just curious. They were laced with amusement and a kind of pity that felt sharper than scorn. "Bought the old Icehouse," a woman murmured to her neighbor, shaking her head. "Poor thing must be touched in the head." A group of boys playing with a hoop stopped and pointed, their faces open with childish cruelty. Lucinda felt their stares like stones against her back, but she kept walking. Her focus narrowed to the simple, rhythmic task of putting one foot in front of the other. She led the mare past the blacksmith's shop, where the clang of the hammer paused as she went by. She passed the saloon, and the laughter from within spilled out, seeming to mock her personally. Jedediah Barlow rode up alongside her, his horse a fine, glossy chestnut that made dust look even more pathetic. He tipped his hat in a gesture of mock chivalry. "A word of advice, Miss Hale," he said, his voice oozing false concern. "There's a reason that place has been empty for 2 decades. It's built over a sinkhole, they say. Unstable. You'd be better off sleeping in a ditch." He smiled his thin, predatory smile. "But then, I suppose a ditch doesn't come with a key, does it?" He chuckled at his own wit and spurred his horse, cantering down the street as if he had important business to attend to, leaving the scent of leather and superiority in the air. Lucinda didn't answer. She didn't look at him. She just kept walking toward the north end of town, where the buildings grew sparser and the prairie began to reclaim its own. The last structure before the open road was a small, neat cabin with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney. An old woman sat on the porch, wrapped in a colorful blanket despite the mild evening. Her face was a roadmap of wrinkles, her hair 2 long braids of silver. She was Osage, and the townspeople regarded her with a mixture of fear and respect, calling her Quiet Water. She had been here before the town had a name, and they said she saw things others did not. As Lucinda passed, the old woman raised a hand, not in greeting, but to bid her stop. Lucinda paused, dust coming to a halt beside her. The woman's eyes, dark and bright as a bird's, took in everything. The exhausted girl, the worn-out horse, the deed in her hand, the heavy key. She looked from Lucinda to the distant, hulking shape of the Icehouse, barely visible on the horizon. For a long moment she said nothing, the only sound the sigh of the wind through the dry grass. Then her voice, when it came, was low and resonant, like stones rubbing together at the bottom of a river. "Some things," she said slowly, each word given its own space, "are buried not to be forgotten, but to be found by the right hands." Lucinda stared at her, the strange pronouncement settling in the quiet air between them. It was not a warning, not exactly. It felt more like a blessing or a riddle. The right hands. She looked down at her own, calloused and smudged with dirt. They did not feel like the right hands for anything. "Thank you," Lucinda murmured, though she wasn't sure what she was thanking her for. The old woman gave a slow, deliberate nod, then turned her gaze back to the horizon, as if Lucinda were no longer there. The conversation was over. Lucinda gently tugged on Dust's lead and continued her journey. The mockery of the town faded behind her, replaced by the echo of the old woman's cryptic words. They followed her out onto the prairie, a small, puzzling weight in her heart, a counterpoint to the heavy iron key in her hand. The walk to the Icehouse took the better part of an hour, leading her away from the town and into the rolling, empty expanse of the prairie. The track was little more than two faint ruts in the earth, long since overgrown with stubborn weeds and prairie grass. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, and the air grew cool, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. The Icehouse stood on a low rise, its silhouette a dark, jagged shape against the dying light. As she drew closer, the clerk's words came back to her. A ruin. He hadn't been exaggerating. It was less a building and more a monument to decay. Constructed of thick timber and stone, it was built low to the ground, with more of its structure below the earth than above it. The roof, made of heavy planks and sod, had collapsed in the center, creating a gaping wound open to the sky. The massive timber walls, gray and splintered, sagged inward as if tired of standing. A thicket of thorny bushes grew against one side, and the whole place listed slightly, like a ship sinking into a sea of grass. A profound sense of disappointment washed over Lucinda. It was worse than she had imagined. Barlow's laughter echoed in her ears. An ice castle. Dust snorted softly, nudging Lucinda's shoulder with her nose, as if sensing her despair. Lucinda reached up and stroked the mare's neck, her touch a silent promise. "We'll make do," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it. She approached the main door, a monstrous thing of oak planks bound with rusted iron straps. The keyhole was choked with dirt and cobwebs. It took her several minutes of scraping with a twig before she could insert the key. It grated, protested, and then, with a groan of metal that seemed to travel down into the very foundations, the lock turned. She put her shoulder to the door and pushed. It didn't budge. She pushed again, her boots slipping in the loose dirt, putting all of her weight and desperation into the effort. With a shriek of tortured hinges, the door scraped open just enough for her to slip through. The air that rushed out was a physical thing. It was cold, profoundly cold, and carried a smell she had never encountered before. The smell of deep earth, of perpetual damp, and of something organic and ancient. The smell of 20 years of compacted sawdust. Inside, the darkness was absolute. The last rays of sunlight were swallowed by the gloom. She fumbled in her satchel for the small lantern and tin of kerosene she had bought with the wagon money. Her hands trembled as she lit the wick, the small flare of the match seeming impossibly bright. She raised the lantern. The light pushed back the shadows, revealing a cavernous space. The walls were thick, insulated with packed earth. The floor sloped down into a vast, central pit, which was filled nearly to the brim with what looked like dark, loamy soil. The sawdust. It had darkened and decomposed over the decades, becoming a dense, peaty mass. The hole in the roof let in a shower of dirt and dried leaves, which had formed a small mound on the surface. The air was still and dead. It was a tomb. Exhaustion, heavy and final, settled on her shoulders. She couldn't stay in here, not tonight. She backed out, pulling the heavy door closed as best she could, and led Dust to the lee side of the building, sheltered from the wind. She laid out her thin bedroll on the dry ground, using her satchel as a pillow. As darkness fell completely, she lay and listened to the sounds of the prairie and the groans of the old building as it settled. It seemed to be breathing, sighing in its long, lonely sleep. A place buried not to be forgotten, but to be found. The words made no sense, yet they were all the comfort she had. The next morning broke cold and clear. Lucinda awoke stiff and sore, the thin bedroll offering little protection from the hard ground. The first order of business was survival. She found a small, seasonal creek about a quarter-mile away, its water running thin but clear over a bed of smooth stones. She drank deeply herself, then led Dust to the water's edge. The mare drank for a long time, her sides heaving. Lucinda knew she had to find grazing, but first she had to face the icehouse. She needed to make it a shelter, not a tomb. Armed with the faint morning light and her small lantern, she pushed the great door open again and stepped inside. In the daylight, the place was less menacing but no less daunting. The sheer scale of the task ahead was overwhelming. The central pit, at least 40 feet across, and who knew how deep, was filled with the dark, dense sawdust. It had to be cleared at least in part to create a level living space. She had no shovel. She had only her hands and the flat lid of her cooking pot. It was a start. She began in a corner near the door, a section of the wooden floor that was still intact. She used the pot lid to scrape away the top layer of sawdust and debris. It was slow, back-breaking work. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and a beam of light shone down through the hole in the roof, illuminating a column of dust motes dancing in the still air. It was in this beam of light that she first saw it, a detail that didn't fit. Most of the floor surrounding the pit was made of thick, rough-hewn pine planks, laid parallel to the walls, but in the corner she was clearing, there was a single plank about 3 feet long. That was different. It was oak, not pine. Its grain was tighter, its color a darker shade of weathered gray, and it was laid perpendicular to the others, an interruption in the pattern. It looked like a patch, a repair made long after the original construction. She ran her hand over it. The wood was rotten in places, but still solid. It was strange. Why would someone replace a single plank with a different kind of wood and lay it the wrong way? She filed the thought away. It was a curiosity, nothing more. Her priorities were shelter and warmth. She worked until her back ached and her hands were raw. By late afternoon, she had cleared a small area, about 6 feet by 6 feet, down to the floorboards. The air in the icehouse seemed to have its own texture. As she dug deeper into the sawdust, which was damp and cool beneath the surface, she caught a faint, unusual scent. It wasn't the smell of rot or mildew. It was a sharp, metallic tang, like old iron or copper, the kind of smell that clings to old coins left too long in a pocket. It was barely there, a ghost on the air, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of the mismatched oak plank. She paused, sniffing the air like an animal. The scent was strongest near the floor. It was probably just a buried tool, she told herself, a dropped piece of hardware from the men who built this place. Still, it was another small thing that felt out of place. She stood up, brushing the dark sawdust from her dress. She had a space to sleep, a tiny island of order in a sea of decay. That night, she brought her bedroll inside, placing it on the newly cleared planks. She left the heavy door wedged open a crack to let in fresh air. As she lay in the profound darkness, the silence of the icehouse seemed to press in on her. It felt like a listening silence, a waiting silence. The image of the single oak plank laid against the grain floated in her mind. It was a loose thread in the fabric of the place, a question without an answer. Days bled into a week, and the week stretched toward 2. Lucinda fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun and her own exhaustion. Each morning, she would take Dust to the creek and find a new patch of sparse grass for the mare to graze. Then she would return to the icehouse and work. Labor became her shield against despair. She scavenged fallen branches from a nearby copse of cottonwoods to fuel a small, makeshift fire pit she built outside. She used mud and grass to chink the gaps in the timber walls, stopping the worst of the wind. She found a section of the sod roof that was still intact and, with immense effort, managed to drag it over the hole, creating a crude but effective patch. The work was grueling, but with each small improvement, the icehouse felt less like a grave and more like a refuge. And all the while, she continued to excavate the sawdust. She had found a rusted shovel head near the creek, and after fashioning a new handle from a sturdy branch, her work accelerated. She was determined to clear the entire floor space around the central pit. The sawdust came out in heavy, damp clumps, smelling of earth and time. Her silent companion through it all was dust. The old mare would stand just outside the open door for hours, watching Lucinda work, her presence a quiet, steady comfort. Sometimes Lucinda would talk to her, her voice soft in the vast space. "We'll need to lay in supplies for winter, old girl," she'd murmur, pausing to wipe sweat from her brow. "This place will be cold, but it's solid." The mare would flick an ear or give a low snort, as if in agreement. The physical labor was changing Lucinda. Her hands, already calloused, became tough as leather. The muscles in her back and arms grew defined. The hollow-eyed sorrow in her face was slowly being replaced by a sharp, focused determination. She was no longer just surviving, she was building. One afternoon, as she was clearing the last corner of the floor, her shovel struck something with a dull, heavy thud. It wasn't the sharp ring of metal on stone. It was a thick, resonant sound. Wood on wood. She stopped, her heart giving a sudden hard beat. She knelt down and cleared the last layer of sawdust away with her hands. It was the mismatched oak plank. She had cleared all around it now, and its strangeness was even more pronounced. It was the only piece of oak in a floor of pine. She remembered the faint metallic scent she had noticed on her first day. It was stronger here, emanating from the very ground beneath the plank. An idea, illogical and faint, began to form in her mind. This was not a repair, it was a marker. She took the blade of the shovel and wedged it into the crack between the oak and the surrounding pine. She put her weight on the handle, using it as a lever. The rotten edges of the plank splintered, but the main body held firm. She repositioned the shovel, found a better purchase, and pushed down with all her strength. There was a sharp crack, and the plank lifted a few inches. Underneath was not solid earth or foundation beams. There was only more of the dark, compacted sawdust. But this sawdust was different. It was darker, damper, and felt almost greasy to the touch. With a sense of trembling anticipation, she put the plank aside and began to dig with her bare hands. The metallic smell was strong now, unmistakable. Just a few inches down, her fingers brushed against something hard, cold, and unyielding. It wasn't a rock, it was flat with a distinct, sharp edge. She scraped away more of the dirt. A corner of dark wood emerged, bound with a strap of black, pitted iron. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the top of a box, a very old, very heavy box, deliberately buried and marked for someone to find. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the immense quiet of the icehouse. For a long moment, she simply knelt there, her fingers resting on the cold iron strap. The world outside, the town Barlow, her grief, it all fell away. There was only this space, this silence, and the secret the floor had held for 2 decades. This was real, this was not a figment of her lonely imagination. A fierce, protective energy surged through her. Whatever this was, it was hers. It belonged to the icehouse, and the icehouse belonged to her. She had no tools for a delicate excavation. She had only her shovel and her own 2 hands. She began to dig around the edges of the box, her movements urgent but careful. The object was larger than she'd thought. A military-style footlocker or crate, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. It was heavy, solid. It took her the better part of an hour to clear the earth from around it, her muscles screaming in protest. Finally, it sat fully exposed in its shallow grave, a dark, oblong shape in the gloom. It was sealed shut, a heavy padlock on its hasp, so rusted it looked like a single solid lump of iron. There was no key. Of course, there was no key. She looked around the cavernous space, her eyes landing on the small pile of her father's things, his whetstone, and next to it, the one tool he had always kept with his belongings, a short, heavy crowbar. She had almost sold it for food money, but something had stopped her. It felt like a part of him. She retrieved it now, the weight of it familiar and reassuring in her hand. She wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam of the lid next to the lock. She took a deep breath and pushed down. The old wood groaned, but held. She repositioned the crowbar, finding a better angle, and threw her entire body weight into it. There was a loud, splintering crack, and the hasp tore away from the wood. The lock fell to the floor with a dull thud. The crate was open. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy lid. It creaked open, revealing the contents. The first thing she saw was a sheet of dark, oiled canvas laid carefully over the top. It was still supple and had protected whatever was beneath from the damp. She lifted the corner of the canvas, and she forgot how to breathe. Gold, stacks of it. The light from her lantern fell upon row after row of neatly stacked coins, their surfaces gleaming with a soft, buttery light that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. They were double eagles, $20 gold pieces, bearing the mark of the United States Federal Mint. It was a fortune beyond her wildest imaginings, more money than she had ever seen or conceived of in one place. It was enough to buy the entire town of Redemption Creek 10 times over. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the top coin. It was cool and heavy, a solid, undeniable reality. But as she stared, mesmerized, she noticed something else tucked into a small, recessed compartment at the side of the crate. It was a leather pouch, tied with a simple thong. Her fingers, clumsy with shock, fumbled with the knot. She opened the pouch and tipped its contents into her palm. It wasn't more gold. It was a small, thin book, a ledger bound in worn black leather. She opened it. The inside was filled with neat, methodical script. The first page was a date, April 14th, 1864. Below it, a heading, Distribution of Assets. And below that, a list of names. She scanned the list, her blood running cold. She recognized them. Or rather, she recognized the family names. Silas Croft, the town's first blacksmith. Jebediah Stone, the former sheriff. Marcus Thorne, the merchant who had founded the general store. The founding fathers of Redemption Creek, their names etched into a plaque in front of the town hall. And there, near the bottom of the list, a name that made her gasp. Elias Barlow, Jedediah Barlow's father. Tucked into the back of the ledger was a single folded piece of paper, a note, its ink faded but still legible. It was short and direct. U.S. Army payroll, 4th Cavalry, derailed west of Springfield. A gift from Providence to build a new life. Split 16 ways, God forgive us. It wasn't a gift from Providence, it was theft. This wasn't a fortune, it was evidence. The prosperity of Redemption Creek, the wealth of its leading families, the power that men like Barlow wielded. It was all built on a lie, on a secret buried in the sawdust of a forgotten icehouse. She closed the ledger, the weight of it far heavier than all the gold in the crate. The cryptic words of the old Osage woman echoed in her mind. Some things are buried not to be forgotten, but to be found by the right hands. She looked down at her own hands, covered in the dark, peaty sawdust. What was she supposed to do? This knowledge was a weapon. It could destroy the town, destroy the men who had built it, including the father of the man who had wronged her so deeply. The temptation for revenge was a hot, bitter taste in her mouth. But it was more than that. It was a truth that had been waiting, patient and cold, for someone to give it voice. As she knelt there in the gloom, the silence of the icehouse was no longer empty. It was filled with the ghosts of soldiers who never got their pay, of a crime that had become a foundation. And she, Lucinda Hale, the girl with nothing, was now the keeper of it all. Just as this terrible new reality was settling upon her, the weather turned. The wind, which had been a gentle sigh all day, began to moan around the corners of the icehouse. The sliver of sky visible through the crack in the door grew dark, a bruised purple-gray, a blue norther. She had heard tales of them, sudden, violent storms that swept down from the plains, bringing with them a terrifying drop in temperature and gale-force winds. She scrambled to her feet, her mind snapping from the past to the immediate, desperate present. She quickly covered the crate, shoving the ledger back into its pouch and pulling the oilcloth over the gold. She dragged the heavy oak plank back over the hole, scattering sawdust over it to hide the seams. It was a clumsy concealment, but it would have to do. The first clap of thunder was a cannon shot directly overhead, shaking the very timbers of the building. A blast of frigid air forced its way through the door. She had to get dust inside. The mare was already pressed against the lee wall, her eyes wide with fear. Lucinda fought the wind to open the door wider, coaxing the terrified animal into the cavernous space. The moment the horse was inside, Lucinda threw her shoulder against the door, using the crowbar to wedge it shut against the howling gale. The storm hit with the fury of a physical assault. Rain and hail hammered against the patched roof. The wind shrieked, testing every chink and crack she had so painstakingly filled. The old building groaned and shuddered, but it held. Her work had been sound. The Icehouse, her ruin, was now a fortress against the storm. She lit her lantern, the small flame a defiant pinpoint of warmth in the vast, cold dark. Dust stood trembling but safe, her flank warm against Lucinda's side. For hours the storm raged. It was a physical and emotional collapse, a reflection of the chaos that had just been unleashed in her own heart. She huddled with the mare, the secret of the gold a burning weight in her mind, the storm outside a terrifying echo of the turmoil within. Then, above the roar of the wind, she heard another sound, a human sound, a faint, desperate cry for help, nearly swallowed by the gale. "Help, please, anyone." Lucinda's head snapped up. She strained to listen. It came again, closer this time. Someone was out there, caught in the storm. She looked at the wedged door, at the relative safety of her shelter. Her first instinct was to stay put, to protect herself, her horse, her secret. But the cry came again, weaker this time, laced with panic. It was the sound of a woman. Without a second thought, she grabbed the crowbar and fought the door open again, leaning into the wind. A blast of icy rain hit her face. Peering into the maelstrom, she saw them. A broken-down wagon, its axle snapped, and 3 figures huddled beside it. A man, a woman clutching her swollen belly, and a small, shivering child. They were the rescued strangers, delivered by the storm. "Here," Lucinda shouted, her voice torn away by the wind. "Over here." She waved her lantern, a beacon in the tempest. The man saw it and, half carrying his wife, they stumbled toward the light, their son trailing behind. Lucinda helped them inside, into the impossible safety of the old Icehouse, and barred the door once more against the raging night. The choice had been made for her. She was no longer just the keeper of a secret. She was the keeper of a shelter. The family collapsed just inside the door, soaked, freezing, and in shock. The woman was clearly in the late stages of pregnancy, her face pale and strained. The man, though exhausted, had a look of fierce gratitude. Their son, a boy of about 6, stared at Lucinda with wide, frightened eyes. "Thank you," the man gasped, his teeth chattering. "We broke an axle. The wind, we thought we were done for." Lucinda wasted no time. She gave them her own dry blanket, wrapping it around the woman and child. She stoked the small fire she had built in a makeshift hearth of stones, the smoke finding its way out through a gap in the eaves. It wasn't much, but it was warmth. She shared the last of her bread and dried apples, her own hunger forgotten. The Icehouse, the butt of the town's jokes, had become a sanctuary. The family, whose names were John and Mary, with their son Thomas, huddled by the small fire, their shivering slowly subsiding. John explained they were heading west to Oregon, hoping to claim a piece of land before the baby came. "We saw the roofline from the road," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It looked like a ruin, but it was the only hope we had." Mary, the pregnant woman, looked around the vast, shadowy space. She saw the quiet girl who had saved them, her worn dress, her calloused hands. She saw the old mare standing peacefully in the corner. She saw the neatness of the cleared floor, the patched roof, the determined little fire. "You've made a home here," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet awe. Lucinda just nodded, unable to speak. The simple, sincere words struck her more deeply than any praise she had ever received. She hadn't just been surviving, she had been creating something. A home. All through the night, as the storm howled outside, Lucinda tended to the family. She made a warm broth from her meager supplies for Mary, and sat with the boy, Thomas, telling him a quiet story to calm his fears until he fell asleep. In this act of sheltering others, she felt a profound shift within herself. The gold beneath the floorboards seemed less like a treasure or a weapon, and more like a responsibility. It was a tool, and she was its steward. When the first light of dawn broke, the storm had passed, leaving a world scrubbed clean and unnaturally quiet. John, a carpenter by trade, insisted on helping Lucinda properly repair her roof patch and strengthen the door before he set to work on his wagon. As they left 2 days later, the wagon repaired with wood Lucinda had helped him find, Mary pressed a small, carved bird into her hand. "We won't forget this," she promised. "We'll tell everyone of the girl in the old icehouse who saved us." Lucinda watched them go, her heart full. Word of Lucinda's act spread faster than a prairie fire. The family, stopping in Redemption Creek for supplies, told their story at the general store. They spoke of the fierce storm, their broken wagon, and the quiet, strong young woman who had taken them in, sharing what little she had. They didn't describe a ruin, they described a sanctuary. The townspeople listened, their expressions shifting from skepticism to grudging respect. The girl they had mocked had shown more grit and charity than any of them. A few weeks later, a stranger rode into town. He was a tall, lean man with a calm demeanor and observant eyes. He wasn't a cowboy or a farmer. He wore a city coat, and he carried the quiet authority of the law. He introduced himself to the sheriff as U.S. Marshal Frank Taggart. He was following a cold trail, he explained, a decades-old rumor about a stolen Union Army payroll. His investigation had led him to this region, and a recent story he'd heard in a nearby county about a family sheltered in an old icehouse had piqued his interest. The sheriff, a man who preferred to let sleeping dogs lie, pointed him north out of town with a shrug. Taggart found Lucinda splitting firewood outside the icehouse. She saw him coming and stood straight, her hand resting on the axe handle. Watchful but not afraid, he tipped his hat. "Miss Hale, I'm Marshal Taggart." He dismounted and approached slowly. "I'm told you've made a home of this place." His eyes took in the solid repairs, the neat woodpile, the healthy-looking mare. "I'm also told you're a person of principle." Lucinda met his gaze and saw no threat there, only a deep, weary integrity. In that moment, she made her decision. She led him inside, and without a word she lifted the oak plank and showed him the crate. She showed him the gold, and she handed him the ledger. The marshal knelt, examining the coins, his expression unreadable. He opened the ledger, his eyes scanning the names. He read the note. He was silent for a long time. "I've been chasing this ghost for 5 years," he said at last, his voice a low murmur. "I never thought I'd find it." He looked up at Lucinda, his eyes filled with a profound, quiet respect. "There is a federal finder's fee for the recovery of government property, Miss Hale. 10%. It's the law." As if summoned by the gravity of the moment, another rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. It was Jedediah Barlow. He had seen the marshal's horse tied outside the icehouse and had come in a panic. He burst in, his face pale with sweat. "What's the meaning of this? This is private property." His eyes fell on the open crate of gold and the ledger in the marshal's hand. All the color drained from his face. He looked from the gold to Lucinda, and in his eyes she saw not just fear, but a dawning, horrified understanding. The secret his family's fortune was built on was lying exposed on the dirt floor. The marshal stood up slowly. He didn't raise his voice. "The statute of limitations on this crime ran out a long time ago, Mr. Barlow," he said, his voice calm and level. "The men in this book are mostly dead. The town is here. There's no justice to be had in tearing it all down now." He folded the ledger and tucked it into his coat. But the gold is returning to the federal treasury. And the truth, well, the truth is out. Barlow stared, speechless, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a hollow, defeated man. He was not arrested. He was not shamed with shouts or accusations. He was simply undone by a quiet truth, revealed by the girl he had cast out. He turned and stumbled away, a man suddenly burdened by the weight of his own history. The townspeople, who had followed at a distance, saw it all. They saw Barlow's retreat. They saw the marshal treat Lucinda not as a fool, but as an equal. Their laughter had long since died. Now, it was replaced by a silent, spreading awe. In the golden hour of a crisp autumn evening, Lucinda Hale stood before the Icehouse. The air was still, fragrant with the scent of wood smoke and curing grass. Marshal Taggart had departed that morning, taking the gold with him, but leaving behind a notarized federal draft for a sum of money that still seemed unreal to her. Her silent companion, Dust, grazed peacefully nearby, her coat filled out, her head held high. The old mare was no longer a picture of exhaustion, but of contentment. The Icehouse itself was transformed. It was no longer a sagging ruin, but a solid, respectable homestead. The roof was whole, the door hung on new, perfectly balanced hinges, a silent gift left on her doorstep by the blacksmith's son. The community, once a chorus of mockery, had begun to reach out in small, quiet ways. A basket of late-season vegetables from one family, a sack of flour from another. They were gestures of apology, of respect. They saw her now not as the fool who bought a ruin, but as the woman who had unearthed its soul and, in doing so, had shown them their own. The marshal, before he left, had asked her what she would do now. "You could go anywhere," he'd said. "Build a mansion in St. Louis." She hadn't answered him then. She hadn't known the answer herself. But now, standing here, watching the last light of the sun burnish the old timbers of her home, she knew. She looked at the solid walls, the shelter she had made from nothing. She looked at her own hands, strong and capable. She thought of the buried secret, the storm, the family she had saved. She had come to Redemption Creek seeking redemption, and had found it not in a name, but in the earth, in labor, in a forgotten structure. She murmured the words to the quiet air, a promise to herself and the prairie. "They thought I bought an ice house," she whispered, "but I was just buying back a foundation. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this journey." This has been a story about the quiet dignity of starting over, and how the greatest treasures are often hidden not for their value, but for their truth. If you were moved by Lucinda's story, we'd be grateful if you'd leave a like and a comment below. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of hidden history and remarkable destinies. Our next story takes us to the high desert of Nevada, where a lone prospector finds a letter in a bottle that will change the course of a river and a war. Until then, be well.